Good morning, Nigeria. Welcome to the newspaper review. I am Kasituni, and I'll be taking you through this segment. First, we'll start with the nation. Boldly written, Supreme Court sends MAG-led ADC NWC back to High Court. Together on page 8 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, federal government okays 7 trillion naira for road, bridge and other projects, together on page 4 of the newspaper. NEC adopts 112 as unified national emergency number. You get that on page 3. Police deploy 1,068 combat constables. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, still in politics, INEC restores mark others on portal. You get that on page 7 of the newspaper. Wike, no more faction in PDP, no complacency, says Atiku. You continue reading that on page 7 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the Daily Trust, boldly written on page 3 and 4 of the newspaper. Supreme Court clears path for ADC. Supreme Court clears path for ADC. Then on page 27 of the newspaper, 150 persons died in Kwara camp, coming from Amnesty International. Then on page 14 and 27 of the newspaper, Yuguda joins Gombe governor race, vows to sustain Inuwa Yahaya's legacy, backs Tinubu's renewed hope. Yuguda joins Gombe governor race, vows to sustain Inuwa Yahaya's legacy, backs Tinubu's renewed hope. Still in the same newspaper, Benga Hazim asks Tinubu INEC to respect Electoral Act, allow primaries to hold in September. You get that on page 26 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, how much work is being done? That's coming from Workers' Day. You get that on page 6 of that newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, PDP BOT assumes leadership after Supreme Court ruling. You get that on page 5 of the newspaper. Remi Tinubu visits Kano, Borno, Kaduna in 1 week. That's for ahead of the 2027 elections. You get the full gist on page 32 of the newspaper. Sibling buried alive as excavation site collapse in Sokoto. Siblings buried alive as excavation site collapse in Sokoto. This is a very sad story. You get the full gist on page 26 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the Daily Independent, boldly written, Supreme Court orders ADC trial as PDP turmoil escalates. Together on page 29 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, Nigerians struggle to own smartphones as price continues to rise. Together on page 7 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, NASU, SSANU begin indefinite strike today. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, FEC approves $2.99 billion for key rail projects in Lagos, Kano, Kaduna. You get it on page 7 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, federal government states adopt 112 as Nigeria's unified emergency number. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. Breakthrough for Nigeria's gas network as OB3 pipeline crosses River Niger. You get it on page 6 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, stakeholders warn against proposed raw cashew export ban. You get that on page 7 of the newspaper. Then in page 6 of the newspaper, Atiku says workers promise renewed hope, received renewed hardship. Atiku says workers promised renewed hope, received renewed hardship. You get that on page 6 of that newspaper. Tinubu nominates Joseph Tebe as Minister of Power. You get that on page 7 of the newspaper. That's as a result of the current Minister of Power resigning to pursue his governorship ambition. Moving away from that newspaper to the Nigerian Tribune, boldly written on page 17 and page 19 of the newspaper, Supreme Court nullifies PDP Ibadan Convention, void status quo, Antebellum, order on ADC. And then at the top of the newspaper, bridge leaking Kwara, Oyo collapses. You get that on page 30. Bridge linking Kwara, Oyo collapses. You get that on page 30 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, Ambode bags Hamzat as Lagos APC candidate. You get that on page 20 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, OPay expands access to 1.2 billion naira 10-year scholarship program. You get that on page 15 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, rethink labor welfare strategy. CPPE urges government. You get that on page 16 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 16 as well, UBA pushes deeper bank fintech collaboration as Pan-African Conference. Still in the same newspaper, this one is coming from Minister. Women mega rally signal movement for participation to power. Women mega rally signal movement for participation to power. Coming from the minister, you get that on page 4 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, YADC, Accord, ZLP, AA, APP should be deregistered. Coming from AGF tells court. AGF tells court why ADC, Accord, ZLP, AA, APP should be deregistered. You get that on page 18 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the Vanguard, boldly written on page 5, Supreme Court okays ADC's Mark Aziz PDP Turaki. Then at the top of the newspaper, OPE signs new MOUs with 4 more schools, expands access to 1.2 billion 10-year scholarship program. You get that on page 30 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, LCC tax federal government on weak budget execution, delay in funds release. You get that on page 19 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, Remi Tinubu rolls out 1.2 billion naira 100 trucks of rice for vulnerable northern families. Remi Tinubu rolls out 1.2 billion naira 100 trucks of rice for vulnerable northern families. You get that on page 38 of the newspaper. Workers mark May Day in pains as labor decries insecurity, poverty, inflation. Workers mark May Day in pains as labor decries insecurity, poverty, inflation. You get that on page 7 of the newspaper. This is coming from Peter Obi to Tinubu. Borrowing for consumption is killer cancer. You get that on page 9 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the Daily Sun. Boldly written, Supreme Court gives Mark-led ADC, NWC lifeline, settles PDP's case. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper as well, Tinubu says borrowing for consumption is cancerous. You get that on page 29 of the newspaper. Motorists groaned as petrol price nears 1,400. You get that on page 25 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, Labour marks May Day as federal government declares holiday. You get that on page 26 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper on page 26 as well. Don't repeat 2023 election mistake. Wike tells Abuja monarchs. Don't repeat 2023 election mistakes. Wike tells Abuja monarch. Still in the same newspaper on page 27, varsities brace up for disruption as SANU, NASU begin strike. Still in the same newspaper, security titans as suspect appear in court, plead not guilty. You get that on page 4 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the blueprint. Boldly written, Supreme Court returns ADC leadership dispute to Federal High Court. You get that on page 8 of the newspaper. Tinubu nominates policy reform expert Tegbe as power minister. You get that on page 11 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, Troop killed 201 terrorists, arrested 284 leaders, collaborators in April, coming from the defense headquarters. You get that on page 8 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the matrix. Boldly written, Supreme Court's judgments trigger fresh crisis. You get that on page 2 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, NNPC Limited achieves major milestones as OB3 pipeline successfully crosses River Niger. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper at the bottom, INEC reacts to Supreme Court ruling, recognizes MAG-led ADC. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the Guardian, boldly written, clarity, uncertainty as Supreme Court reshapes opposition ahead of 2027. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. Then at the top of the newspaper on page 3, INEC affirms exclusive right to declare poll results as CSOs deploys tracker. Then in page 3 of the newspaper as well, FEC approves $2.9 billion rail project for Lagos, Kano, Kaduna. Still in the same newspaper, Respect Electoral Act, shift primaries to September, Hazim tells Tinubu and INEC. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper as well. Then on page 4 of the newspaper, by your right, Boko Haram threatens to execute 416 captives. Boko Haram threatens to execute 416 captives. Still in the same newspaper by your left, worsening cost of living crisis overshadow May Day despite wage increase. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, federal government begins 18-month database modernization ahead of census. You get that on page 8 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, federal government resolves MM2 concession dispute, approves aircraft leasing firm. You get that on page 7 of the newspaper. Niger local governments record 2 polio cases as Katsina decries gaps in vaccination. You get that on page 8 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the Daily Monitor. Boldly written, Supreme Court sets aside Court of Appeal ruling. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. At the top of the newspaper, can demands swift response of adopted Ekiti church members. You get that on page 4 of the newspaper. Dangote refinery recalls redeployed engineers. You get that on page 7 of the newspaper. Tube neutralized 216 terrorists. Apprehend 284 across theaters in April, coming from defense headquarters. You get that on page 2 of the newspaper. NASU, SSANU begin nationwide strike on May 15, cite unresolved demand. You get that on page 2 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, Turaki-led PDP faction loses as Supreme Court voids Ibadan Convention. You get that on page 27 of the newspaper. We've come to the end of the newspaper review. Many thanks for watching. I am Kasitoni. Do well to join us next time for more breaking news across Nigeria. Do have a beautiful day.